Sometimes we want to store more than one value into a single variable. That's where arrays are useful. An array allows us to store a list of ordered values into a single value. In this video, we'll see how to create arrays in JavaScript. Arrays represent lists of objects. We're going to see how we're going to create them in JavaScript. So we'll be working on this page in our Chrome, and we're going to be continuing to experiment with the developers tools, which we open by hitting Command Option J, or locating the developers tools from your menu. Now I just have a basic page here, and we can see what that page looks like if we go to our editor and we see index.html. And at the end of our page, we're including a arrays.js. And right now it's an empty JavaScript file, but this is where we'll be experimenting with JavaScript arrays. So let's take a look at a basic array. Like I said, arrays represent lists of values in JavaScript. Now this is useful when you have an unknown number of objects that you want to store, because then you cannot store them into individual variables. Instead, by using an array, we can use one variable to store almost any number of objects. So let's create our first array. We'll store it into a variable called x. And the way we define a JavaScript array is using square brackets. Inside of these square brackets, we put in the different values that we want to store in our array. So, for instance, let's store 3 different strings into this array that we're calling x. The first value will be a string that says sum. And then to separate values, we use the comma. So we can add a second value. We'll say words. And then just by putting another comma, we can have our third. We'll just say the word here. So we can save this out, and if we check it out in our browser by refreshing and pulling up the variable x, we can see that the JavaScript tools will show us the array representation of our words. So we say this is an array with 3 elements in it, and those 3 elements are strings. Now, one part of an array that we always can use is called the length. So let's do a console.log, and we're going to take our variable x, and this is a property on our x array, and we call it .length. And at any given time, .length will represent the number of elements that reside inside of our array. Since we can see that there are 3 elements in our array right now, we should see the console.log in our developers tool show the number 3. So if we refresh, we can see that 3 is the length of our array. Now if we added an extra value, we'll say a 4th value with the string extra, words here, and we were to save it and refresh it, we can see x.length now represents 4. So far, our array has just contained 3 different strings, but we can mix and match the types of variables that we put into our array. So let's say we put var y equals, and then to create the array, we use our square brackets again. And we can put all sorts of different values as the parts of our array. So for instance, we could start with a string, and then put a comma to put our next value. Then we could put, let's say, the number 3. And then maybe a Boolean value like true. Maybe another string, treehouse. And we could even store things like functions. And remember, functions from Introduction to Programming store pieces of code that we can use later. So we could have a function that takes 2 arguments, a and b, and returns the result of a plus b. And if we go back to our browser and check it out, and we look at y, we can see that it stored all of those different values right into the same array. And if we took a look at y.length, we'll see that y.length is 5. Now besides these simple values like strings, booleans, numbers, and functions, we could also add arrays inside of arrays. So let's change the 3rd item from true to being another array. And again, all we need to do is open up a square bracket, and we could put some extra values in here. So a sub array, and maybe some numbers. And now we can see the array contains a string, a number, another array, which that array contains a string and 3 numbers. But then if we look at the top level array, after that, there's a string and then a function. So what is the length of our array stored in y? Well, remember that the subarray counts as only one item in our upper array. So if we count our string is 1, our number makes 2, our array as a whole makes 3, treehouse makes 4, and our function makes 5 elements. Just because there's an array with an extra 4 elements does not mean that the array y will have a longer length. The length property only counts the number of objects. It doesn't count the number of objects in any subarray that you might have inside of your main array. We could also create an empty array. So let's put a variable called z. And to do that, all we need to do is open and close our square brackets. This represents an empty array. And if we go and refresh and take a look at z, we see it's represented as the open and close square brackets because there's nothing inside of our array. And if we check out z.length, predictably, it's 0. Now these are the main ways that we create a literal array, meaning that we use a special syntax in JavaScript to define the array and the elements inside of it. There is an alternative way to create an array using the array constructor. You may see this in code, but it's very often not what you want to do. It's very easy to use this literal form, so using the array constructor is not recommended, but I do want to show you what it looks like so you'll recognize it if you're ever reading code and encounter it. So let's say we have a variable a, and we want to create an array. We could do variable a equals new array with parentheses here. And this will construct a new empty array, so if we go back and refresh, we can see that the representation is the same, and if we take a look at the length, it's still 0. So since it's longer to type out, why would we ever want to do new array when we could simply just replace it with these open and close brackets? Well, there is one case where the array constructor may be useful to you. Let's say you wanted to create an array that initially has a length to it. Now this isn't useful very often because all of the values will be undefined, but if you do pass a number to this array constructor like 50, and we save it out and refresh, let's take a look at a. It's going to represent as empty, but if we take a look at a.length, we'll see it's 50. Again, I wouldn't recommend using this unless you have a good reason that you need your length to be set to something else. By default, the length will expand and contract as you remove or add elements to your array. But I just wanted to show you this array constructor because you may see it in some code and it may confuse you. But anytime you're creating an array, using the square bracket literal notation will definitely be an easier and more clear way to define your arrays. So now we've seen how to create our arrays. In the next video, we'll see how to set values into our arrays and retrieve values from our arrays.